We're continuing this time with the Aspire application that I've been putting together over the last few videos, and particularly we're going to address a couple of problems that we had with the SQL Server Docker container that we put in previously. And we didn't see those problems, they're a bit obscure, but that's what we're going to look at. Now, I've made a slight change in functionality so that we can see this, in that I've added to the system the ability to add new authors, not just display the existing ones. And we've done that very simply. If we look at the Blazor, we've got a new page called Create Author, where we've got a simple form there that takes the first name and the last name, sends it off to the API service, and then in the API service, we just send that off to do a post, which we've got there, and then on the API, I've actually implemented that just as a minimal API endpoint. So there we've got the post that pops the new author into the database. So nothing fancy there. Let's take a look at that running actually deployed. So this is the deployed site on Azure that's got all of that, and we can make that work because what we can do is just go to the Blazor front end. There we can see, remember, the existing books and authors that have been put in for us. And what I'm going to do is just go to this create. There's the form I just showed you, and let's pop in another author, Mary Renault, and create author. And you can see it just reports back the ID that was allocated to us by the database. And then if we go to home, we can see that that's being listed down there amongst the other authors. So pretty simple functionality there, but there is one really big problem, because if I go to the dashboard again, and let's just stop this SQL Server instance. So that's stopped the Docker container for that. And then let me restart that, which will take a moment or two. It's just activating, as you can see down there. So we'll whiz ahead to get that done. And now we can see that's running. But if we go back to the actual Blazor page and refresh that, then you're going to see we're going to start getting some errors. And again, it'll take a little while to actually get that. And there you can see the error coming in there, and it's obviously failed on the request. So we can see that Blazor itself is working, but the reason it's failed is because when we're running the SQL Server as a Docker container, when we stop it and restart it, it just recreates the container from the original image. And so it lost any changes that we made. And so that's all of the data and even the database structure that we put in there. Because remember, if we just look at Visual Studio, the way that worked was in the program for the API, it was down here that it did the ensure created, that generated the tables, and then populated the tables with data. But because we don't have the tables, we're just getting a failure straight away. So a way we could get that to work, not a particularly good one, but it will show the principle, is if we actually stop the API and then restart the API, that means that that bit of code we're just looking at here will get executed again. And so having got the new Docker container, we'll then refresh it and it should start working fine. So if we go back and look at that, once that's up and running, again, it'll take a little while. So let's speed that forward. And there we've got that. And so now if we go back to the Blazor page and refresh that, we can see that we've got our data back, except of course, we've only got the data that we generated as part of startup, some dummy data. We've lost that Mary Renault that we'd added. And so that's clearly a useless solution to lose data just because you have to restart your container, which you don't want to happen very often, but it's going to happen occasionally. Certainly you don't want to lose data for that. So let's see how we can address that problem. And also that other problem mentioned, that we haven't got any migration in there. We've just got the simple create, and it won't do any further migration work. So let's sort that out. And so what we're going to do is, firstly, in here, we're going to add a migration. So again, this is standard stuff that you'll get with Entity Framework. So I'm going to go to the Package Manager console, which is where I like to do it. You can do it at other consoles as well. And I'm going to put in an add migration. And because there are so many projects here, you've got to be a bit careful about specifying which one it's on. In fact, we want this to be on the API project because that's where we've got the DB context, and that's the key thing that matters. So we're going to do the project of Blazor pre-rendering.api, and I'm going to copy that because we also want that to be the startup project, because although really it's the app host that's the startup project, the app host doesn't have the information that we need, so we just put them both into that one there, and then we give it a name and just use the standard initial create for that one, and then run that, and that should, after it's done the build, then generate our migrations, which we can then make use of. And so you can see there, it's added in the migrations in the normal way. Nothing special about that. Now, the way that typically during development we then put that migration into the database is with an update database that would again put in at the package manager console. Now, there's a slight problem there because we don't really know where the database is. We don't have anything in the app settings for any of these projects that specifies where the connection string is, because it's all done for us by Aspire, as we saw last time. We could get hold of it, so we could actually, if we run this up locally, and then remember we can look in the API's details and scroll down and look at the connection string that we have there. So we could actually copy that and as a parameter on the update database make use of that. But it's a bit fiddly to have to do, and it's even more fiddly if you want to do it to the deployed database. So a much easier way we can do this is actually just to go into the program for the API. And where previously we'd been doing this ensure created, what we've replaced that with is simply a different command, which is migrate. And that will use the migration information whenever this application starts up. And if we're on a later migration than is actually available in the database, then it'll make use of that. So that's what we can do there. Let's just, because we've already got that database, I'm just going to kill that instance locally, because I'm going to run this locally first, so that it will generate a new one when we run that up, and we'll do that migration. So we'll delete that, and then we'll run the application locally, but it'll do that migrate as it runs through, and that will generate our database for us. So we can see that. Takes a little while, remember, because it's got to start up the Docker container again from nothing, because I deleted it. And then once the API runs, it will then add that migration and everything should get working. And so we can see everything started up. If we go to Blazor, then we can see it's got the seed data in there. But also, if we look at the API and again get hold of that connection string, and if we copy that, then remember we can actually connect to this locally by going into SQL Server Management Studio and just paste that in there and connect to it. And now if we look at the databases, there's our library DB, there's our tables, and now we can see that we've got a migrations history in there, just the one initial create, but we can see that that's working just like we had it before. And that means, of course, now when we deploy this and it runs up, it will do that same migrate and we'll get the structure put into the database with the migrations history. So let's make use of that. But before we do, I'm going to do one other very simple thing that will solve that other problem we saw about the fact that it lost all the data if we had to restart the database. It's very simple to do. All you need to do is go into the app host, and where we added the SQL Server, so that's where we configured the Docker container, we do a dot with and then data volume. And it's suggesting the name library data. And what that will do is create some storage when we're running on Azure, which will be able to store the database data, and therefore it'll be available if ever your container has to restart. So that's the only change we needed to make there. Let's just give that a quick test build to make sure everything's working. And then let's go to the publish and just republish that. And again, remember, this takes quite a while to do, so we'll whiz forward into the future. And so that's finished its work. And the one thing to notice, if we just scroll down, is that we've got an additional resource that's been created from what we had before. There we've got a storage account, and that's what was added because we put in that with data volume so that it can permanently store the data even when the database is refreshed. Okay, so let's go in and take a look at the container app and just log in there. And if we just take a look at the resource group, then again, we'll see it's got that additional storage account that it's making use of. But more importantly, let's see how it's all working. So if we go to the container apps environment and then open up the dashboard, and then we can see everything that's going on in there. You can see it's just doing a bit of work running up the API. The reason that's taking a little while probably is because it's running the migrate that we put in. So it's actually structuring the database so that it will have the correct structure. And then, of course, populate it with that seed data. So that's all happy. Let's look at the Blazor front end. And you can see we've got the seed data. Let's do what we did before. So let's pop in another Mary Renault, create author, go back home. We can see that's listed there. That was all working fine before, but now let's do what we did again, which is to stop SQL Server and then start it up again, and again just give it a little while to get started. And then if we go back to the front end, and remember Mary Renault was the one that I created, not part of the seed data, but if we refresh, then we can see Mary Renault's still there. And so that meant this time when we recreated the SQL Server container, it made use of the data we've got in that storage account. So that's solved what was a pretty serious problem if we hadn't done that. We'd always wanted to behave in this new and better way. One last thing to look at though, we've talked about migrations. Well, let's actually put another migration in there just to show how we can apply that to the live system. So back in Visual Studio, what I'm going to do is make a couple of changes to the data structure. So if we go in here, this is where we've got our models. There's our author. And so I'm going to do two things. One of them is I'm going to change that last name simply to surname. So we're going to do a rename there, call that surname, which of course will mean that the column in the database will need to change to surname as well. And then I'm also going to put on another property on here. And this one I'm going to call nationality. And this one I'm actually going to just initialize to blank, just so we've got something that's going to work okay there. So there we've got a nationality. Now that surname should have trickled through everywhere, but let's just make a slight change with the nationality. So let's go to the Blazor client, and in the home, let's add an extra column and call that nationality. And then also down here, you can see that's where the rename changed last name to surname. But in there, we can put in nationality as well. And then let's go to the create author, and let's just in here, pop in another div. And then that one will change that to nationality, and we'll change that to nationality, and that one, just so that that's going to give us the ability to see this new feature. Then, of course, the next thing I'm going to have to do is add the migrations for that. So let's go into here, just do an up arrow. It's no longer initial create, but we need everything to be the same. So let's just change this to change author columns and let that run. And that seems okay. And you can see it's added a new migration. So there's the change author columns. It's done a rename. It's done an add column, all the things you'd expect. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is then deploy that. I could run it locally, and really I should just to test things, but I'm going to trust myself and not waste time. I go straight to the publish and hit the publish button. And again, this is going to take a long, long time, so we'll whiz ahead. So that's done. Let's go back to Azure. And in here, we should again, if we go to the resource group, be able to see that everything's there. Just one thing I didn't show you earlier on, actually, if we go down to that storage account and click on that, and then have a look in the storage browser and look in file shares, there we can see the data that's being stored. Doesn't matter too much about the details, but that's what it was getting back so that it could persist the database. But let's just go into here and go back to the container apps environment, go to the dashboard, and we can see everything's running. Didn't have to restart anything at all just worked fine. Let's go to the Blazor front end, and we can see, although it's not really showing very much, but we've got that nationality column, and it's just putting blanks in there because all of those were just defaulting. So it's not failing, but it's not absolutely obvious that it's working correctly. But let's go to create, and let's put in Victor Hugo, and then we can put in here our new nationality of French, create that, gone back with an author ID of 5, and then when we go home, you can see we are getting that data. So clearly that upgrade to the migrations has worked because we've definitely got that nationality column and it's all working fine. So that was just to round off what we've done. The first video on this was really just showing how we can add Aspire packages and using SQL Server as an example of that. But then this time we got into a few more of the nitty-gritty details of what you need to do with SQL Server, particularly how you can do migrations. Simplest just by putting that .migrate as we saw into the startup code for your API. And we also saw how to make sure that the data persists even if the Docker container stops and restarts again. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.